about to hear a revolution in talk radio, Liberty Talk Radio, where the critical thinking will defrag your mind of propaganda-ridden viruses induced by mass media news programming. No BS here, just the facts.
And now we present to you America's quintessential iconoclastic anomaly. Wow. In talk radio, your host, Joe Cristiano.
Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Talk Radio, America's libertarian voice, broadcasting from our studio in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to around the world. I'm your host, Joe Cristiano, and this is your antidote to popular talk radio. Today, we're pleased to have as our guest Daniel McAdams. He's the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel served as a foreign affairs, civil liberties, and defense policy advisor to U.S. Congressman Dr. Ron Paul, who was a Republican from Texas, from 2001 until Dr. Paul's retirement at the end of 2012. From 1993 to 1999, he worked as a journalist based in Budapest, Hungary, and traveled through the former communist bloc as a human rights monitor and election observer. Fascinating job. Boy, a lot more exciting than the job that I had in a candy store, I tell you, when I was young. During our live broadcast, we encourage you to call 646-652-4620. I'll repeat, 464-652-4620. And remember to press the one button if you want. If you're listening on the phone, you can listen to the whole program on your iPhone or wherever. But if you want to make a comment or ask a question, press the one button. It'll show up on our board. We'll know to connect you. All right. And we do encourage you to call with your questions. Daniel, welcome to our program.
Thanks so much for having me. Good to be with you.
It's a pleasure and an honor. Now, Daniel, I have to admit that I'm very envious at this point because I have been a follower of Ron Paul, an admirer of Ron Paul's tenacity in the liberty movement for 20 years at least. And in fact, last year, my wife and I dislike driving. I just can't stand sitting in a car driving for hours. But when Ron Paul was down in Austin, Texas, with I think it was the Young Americans for Liberty, I think it was, and it was with Jacob Hornberger, who's a regular on our program as well, and a good old friend of mine, and another organization I support. And by the way, in the interest of full disclosure, I am also a financial supporter of Ron Paul's program. So I send in my monthly check like clockwork. But we actually drove all the way down to Austin, Texas, so that I can meet with Ron Paul and Jacob Hornberger and others down there. So I very rarely go out of my way that way, but I did in that occasion. So now, being in the Middle East, I have to be honest with you. There are concepts that make absolutely no sense to me, but apparently to the average American, which scares me when I say that, makes perfectly good sense. For example, I know people who have good educations, good jobs. I mean, they're successful people, and yet they will defend the concept of the United States is the world's policeman only because someone should be the world's policeman, and it's really our job. And I know you've traveled around the world a lot more than I have. That concept has never made any sense. In fact, just today I was watching on RTV the fact that Japan is in Okinawa and those places in Japan are now protesting against all of the bases we have in Japan, 70 years after the war is over, and yet we're still there. Could you shed some light on that for me, please?
Well, you're right. I mean, the idea of being the world's policeman, first of all, it's a very expensive venture. It's something, ours is probably the stupidest empire in history. If you're going to have an empire, at least, until toward the end of the Roman Empire, it was relatively profitable for Rome to run the known world. All we do is hemorrhage money. And not only do we hemorrhage money, but we make enemies everywhere we go. And it astonishes me that it astonishes any American that a foreigner doesn't like to be told what to do, who to elect, how to behave, where to worship, any more than we would like it here. So there's just such a disconnect between how people feel about their own lives and what they think we should be doing overseas.
I ask these people who are advocates of this world policeman concept. I say, well, what would happen if, let's say, there was a problem in Mexico or Canada, and a foreign nation, you pick whichever one you want, decides to build a base there to help stabilize that country? What would you think? They'd say, we'd go to war immediately. We would send our troops in immediately. And I said, then why isn't that apply to us? And they can never give me the answer. They say, that's because we're the world's policemen. And it's it's a chicken and the egg type thing. And we never get out of that conversation. But what bothers me is now I can see young people who are impressionistic and think Bernie Sanders is going to save the world, or even Donald Trump is going to save the world. I can say, well, they haven't been around the block. But these are mature people. These are people who are business people, successful, good educations, and that's the way they think. And I wonder why they never gravitated from that naive concept, simplistic concept, to all the way to today, and why that has never been corrupted in their own minds, saying, hey, there may be something wrong with that.
Well, there's the issue of it being perceived as a kind of a weakness. There's a kind of a swagger to having a foreign policy with a big stick everywhere. And I think people who live in Middle America, who don't have a lot of direct contact with it, they sort of take some sort of strange pride in this fact. But the truth is, Joe, this is one of the greatest scams in U.S. history, in world history. There are a group of people within the Beltway in D.C. who are living so high on the hog. I mean, there are a lot of S-Class Mercedes driving around inside the Beltway. Right. And these are all the people that are shoveling out all this stuff about how we've got to take out this guy, take out that guy. This guy's a bad guy. We've got to overrun this guy. We've got to police the world. We've got to keep open the sea lanes, or China's going to stop selling us their stuff. Right. And these people are getting wealthy. The think tanks are in on it. The media is in on it. The military-industrial complex is in on it. Political officers in the military are in on it because they know there's going to be a sweet job available to them after they get that 20-year retirement. That doesn't go for a lot of the military, but it certainly goes for some. This is a huge scam. They're draining us dry. $4 trillion in a war on terror, and we've got more terror than ever. So something's not working. If you were running a business that had that kind of a record, you'd take a serious look at your business model.
Oh, yeah. Now, I've always taken a very simplistic approach, solution to this problem. And I know this is going to sound silly, but it would probably work. Would you like to hear it?
Yes.
Okay, here it goes, all right? If we would just close every base around the world, take back all of our military equipment, from ISIS to everybody who we've given equipment to, military equipment, unless they purchased it outright, for whatever, government purchased something outright. We take it all back, put it in the deserts in the Midwest, and instead of exporting guns and exporting propaganda, just export rock and roll. Now, here's my thinking. Seriously, is that we all know that every generation is rebellious. I mean, when you're young, you're rebellious. I don't care where you live in this country, in the world, right? So if you find a young person who is under a very, very austere type of, even whether religious or traditional makeup, it could be anti-everything, anti-American including, and that person gets exposed to rock and roll and sees these DVDs and whatever, they're going to be a little bit rebellious. They're going to say, hey, that doesn't seem so bad to me. That sounds like fun. Give a couple of generations and you will transform the entire social fabric of that country. There's my answer. What do you think?
I think it's a very good one, and I think that your model has been tried and very successfully before. And you talk about Eastern Europe, especially from the 1980s on, when there was a slight cultural easing, and you did see, there were less constraints on people listening to Western music, wearing Western clothes. And when people started to embrace that, they did start to question not only the philosophy of communism, but they started questioning the economics of a system that could not give them what they had hoped for. There was no there were no opportunities for advancement. The cultural life was relatively dead. So those things do work, and they do, it changes the minds of people, and I think it can be very effective. But these are all should be private initiatives. I'm sure you'd agree with that.
Yes.
We should be the ambassadors. We are the
That's
ones
right.
that go over, and we take our CDs with us, of course, but we also take business opportunities. We travel. The biggest lie in the world is that non-interventionists like us are isolationists. That's the last thing that most of us would want to be. We want to travel. We want to trade. We know that world trade and free trade elevates everyone, and it also makes war less likely. So we want to engage the world, show them, as you point out, some of the great aspects of American culture, and this is a very positive thing. So yes, absolutely. Much better than dropping bombs on people.
Yeah, and in being an isolationist, well, people interpret that meaning that we shouldn't be giving foreign aid. I say, no, you're right. We shouldn't be giving foreign aid, not the government. If I want to give aid to a particular country or a cause, which I do, Doctors Without Borders and such as that, if I want to do that, that's my prerogative. I should do that, and hopefully I'm considered to be somebody in America who cares, and maybe I'm a goodwill ambassador because of that, in addition to saving lives. So I'm not an isolationist. I want the military to be isolationist. Many years ago, 20 some odd years ago, my wife and I went to Austria. And I never forget, we were in this small town, don't recall the name of it. In fact, if I did recall, I probably couldn't pronounce it. And there was a little feast going on, and there was German music being played. And it was horrible. It sounded like German marching music, and we're just walking. It was by a railroad track, and there was a train passing by and stuff like that. We were just walking around looking at the trinkets that they were selling, whatever. And no one was in the streets doing anything. People were just milling around. And all of a sudden, a Beach Boy song came on. I tell you, I get chills to this day. I'm not making this up, Daniel. But as soon as that music came on, the streets were flooded with people all dancing in the street. And believe me, I'm not making this up because it's so outlandish. I would be a fool if I made that up and it was not true, obviously. And I couldn't believe people were dancing. And then as soon as that record was over, and then the German, music came on, everyone reverted back to their jobs and whatever. But as soon as the Beach Boys came on, it was like it was a transformation. And that's why I said, my God, all we have to do is export Beach Boy DVDs around the world. There'll be world peace. They'd love us. Things would be great. And I know it sounds simplistic, but I think it'll work.
Yeah, it wouldn't work everywhere, I would say, but there would be some resistance, but it's certainly better than what we're doing. But, your point on foreign aid and personal aid is such a good point, and it makes it even someone who supports foreign aid, and I think a lot of us, Americans are generous people. If there was a hurricane somewhere or something, they would give generously, and they do. But the difference is, and you and I know this, we both work hard to scrape together, a living. But when it's your money and you have it in your hand and you've worked for it, you're going to check out that organization and make sure
That's
that
correct.
the CEO is not making a couple million a year. But with the State Department, when they give out money, they do it through so many layers. They'll have so many sub-NGOs, subcontractors. By the time it trickles down to where it's supposed to help people, it's a couple of bucks. And meanwhile, people are living on $100,000 salaries as consultants. And I was in this world. I was not on the government teat in the NGO world, but I was in a sort of a contrarian NGO. But I saw all around me how this money was just wasted and squandered, and it actually played a very central role in my conversion to non-interventionism and ultimately to libertarianism, is seeing up close and personal what a disaster American foreign policy was.
Yeah. Just yesterday, I saw it may have been this morning, there was an interview with a woman. She was a black woman activist talking about how unfair everything was and how unfair America was to the black people and how the government had to do something, etc. And I kept on thinking to myself, has she ever been around the Beltway? Has she ever seen that within the Beltway, there's all your multimillionaires, and right out of the Beltway is primarily a black community that is extremely poor, and you want to give more money to the Beltway, to the people inside the Beltway? And I said, there was no connection, and they never made that point. And it just angered me that they never, of course, they agreed with everything she said. She was absolutely correct. And yet, they never gave her a different perspective. And when you leave that conversation, if you're not a thinking person, if you're the regular educated American, you'd say, well, geez, I guess it really is that bad. We, meaning the government, should do more. And I get frustrated with that.
It's very difficult. We have such a challenge because when we talk to someone about, we will agree with the problem. The African American community has been ripped off in a big way, but it's by the government. But it's hard to challenge someone's paradigm. When they view the government through the prism of government education. We just did a show on the Ron Paul Liberty Report today with Jim Ostrowski, who's a writer for Lou Rockwell, and he did a book on progressives. But he pointed out the number one thing to do to break out of this mental prison is don't let your kids go to government schools.
Right.
And
absolutely.
So we have such a hard road to hoe to challenge people's real fundamental worldview, and it's I'm sure it's frustrating for you as well.
Yeah. Well, the Oklahoma Council for Public Affairs published a survey, a nationwide survey, of the graduation rate of students who live in American cities. And they don't have to be large American cities. For example, Tulsa I consider a big town, not a big city, not a small city, but a big town, if you will. But it is a city. But it would include even cities the size of Tulsa and smaller, not only the Chicago and Los Angeles. And the graduation rate, this was 2 years ago, the graduation rate was 51%.
Wow.
51%, and it outlined by all the states and whatever, and I was absolutely astonished. So this woman, when she was talking, the question I wanted to ask her said, "Well, is there a government-run school in your neighborhood? How are those children doing? How well? When your son and daughter come home, how many hours do they spend reading, studying?" As, for example, if you came from a Japanese family, when you came home, you spent the entire night studying, and because if you didn't get a top grade, you were in big trouble. Are we doing the same thing here? I wanted to ask those questions, and of course you can't. And if you did, you'd probably be thrown off the air and considered a racist and all that. But we don't want to take personal responsibility. This is what my big gripe is. I think the worst thing that a person can do to another person is be an enabler. If you enable people, you destroy them. You kill them. I mean, there's the very spirit that they have inside to survive and to thrive. You kill. And government is our government is the biggest enabler in the world. And this is proof. This woman was proof of enabling.
Yeah, government is a jealous God.
Yeah. Well, for a second, I never asked you, could you tell us a little bit about the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity? And what are you guys doing these days? And what's the focus of your organization?
Sure. Well, we opened our doors in April of 2013, so just a little bit after Dr. Paul left Congress. And we're very small. It's primarily myself. Dr. Paul is the CEO, and my old colleague from the congressional office, Adam Dick, who's an attorney, is with us as a senior fellow. And our main focus, the impetus to start this institute really was a meeting that Dr. Paul had with the candidates for president of the so-called minor parties after the 08 run, I think it was. And he was able to get together from Cynthia McKinney on the progressive side to Chuck Baldwin on the right, all of the so-called minor candidates to agree on a few basic principles. And it had to do with non-interventionism overseas. It had to do with the Federal Reserve and deficit spending. And to me, it was so tremendous. And I think the statement is still available all online. They all signed this, and it shows that we can put together some differences that we all know that we have on certain issues to focus on areas that we can work together. And that's one of the reasons we have, for example, on our board, we have from Judge Andrew Napolitano, who I consider a libertarian hero,
Right.
To former Representative Dennis Kucinich, who is a progressive hero, an anti-war hero, who put it all on the line to challenge his own party, kind of as Ron Paul did. So what we focus on is primarily education. Look at all the millions of dollars that's gone into these goofy presidential campaigns. What did Bush plonk down? Something like 150 million that he spent disastrously losing. So much money is wasted. If I just elect this guy or that guy, it's going to be a libertarian nirvana. It's not going to happen that way. As Dr. Paul has always said, it's about changing the hearts and minds. It's a slow educational process, bringing people along, like myself once, and I'm sure a lot of us have this sort of conversion stories. You see a little bit of it, and then you put your toe in the door and you see more and more of it, and it all starts to make sense.
Right.
So we focus on foreign policy because that is, I think, just critical. That is where trillions of dollars are wasted, and also where we make enemies overseas. We do a lot of work on foreign policy, on non-interventionism. We do a lot of work on civil liberties at home. We publish, we write, we do interviews. We published Dr. Paul's book last year, Swords into Plowshares, and that's his personal recollection of a life lived sadly during wartime constantly. So we're extremely active. Our website is a pretty major website, and we're very small, but I would humbly say pretty influential. So
yeah. Ron Paul, in that speech, I think it was last year when I went down to Austin with my wife
I was there, by the way.
You were there? I didn't get to see you, I guess I didn't see you. I saw so many people down there.
Really enjoyed. Radley Balco was there. And,
that's right, Balco was there, right.
And Bumper was great. I mean, it's always great to see him. So.
Yeah. That was, it was really worth the trip. But, Ron Paul made a good point. He said, we should really rethink the war on terror. From one perspective alone, if we only did this, and that is that 35 of our soldiers who come back wind up committing suicide. And an untold number are mentally unbalanced or unable to perform normal duties. They may not commit suicide, but they're not totally functional because of their experience. Doesn't that tell us something? That's different than fighting a war. Than if we were just sitting here and someone was attacking our shores and we were firing, we wouldn't have any psychological hang-ups about that. We're protecting our family, I'm protecting my children, or my grandchildren or whatever, But when you go over there and you're told to complete your mission, whatever that is, meaning kill everyone that you see, and when you come back, you can't live with yourself. And yet we haven't come to terms with that, and neither will the mainstream media even bring that forward as a major issue.
Well, what they will do, the mainstream media will advocate to give them more pharmaceuticals, as if somehow a couple of pills that will make things worse will help them. But Dr. Paul talks about this a lot, and it's the absolute immorality of our government as it stands to send these young people over to these places, doing things that they know are immoral, doing things that do not make us safer, but on the contrary, make us less safe. And that's why they come home, because so messed up, because fundamentally, many of them come to understand they're not fighting for America's values. They're not fighting to keep us safe. They're fighting for people in the Beltway, the neocons, the people that are getting wealthy, and talk about how devastating it would be to know that your child was killed for a lie. And that's, I think, is haunting so many families these days.
Oh, yeah. I have friends that came back, and I have one friend here will not talk about it. He won't. In fact, if you mention overseas commitments in the military, he just totally zones out. Will not talk about it, And I guess we don't blame him, so no one says anything. And it's a shame to see what happens to these people. They trip. They go over there. And what bothers me, a real gripe, is that you take a young, impressionable person, right? And you put them in the military, not to defend the country. That's defending your country is one thing, but to go there and teach them how to kill. In other words, you're taking this nice, innocent young person, male, female, makes no difference, and you're teaching them how to kill and to kill. Then they go over there and they have several stints overseas, and they come back and they're never the same. And we don't see that as a crime against humanity?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and it's the government is the criminal in this case, and and it's killing is right. That's one thing, and then but they join the military to be military soldiers and officers, and then they're also sent overseas to do social engineering to tell this society you got to do this, you got to do that, you got to have these NGOs. So they do everything but defend the country.
Yeah, and of course these many of these young men and women can't find jobs because there are no jobs out there worth anything. When I graduated Pace College back in the I guess 1959, 60, whenever it was. I'm really that old, believe it or not. I should have died many years ago, but I'm too mean to do that. I found a job immediately. I had a good job. I was the sales, promotion, and advertising coordinator for AMC stores, right out of college, Didn't pay anything, but it was a great job, great job. But those jobs don't even exist anymore. If you got it, you had to know somebody on the inside to get the job. So if they don't they know how difficult it is, and they default sometimes just to go into the military so they can learn something, because they didn't learn anything in school. They know that. They know they're incapable of doing anything unless they went to a trade school. So they go in the military and they say, well, when I go in the military, I'm going to be trained in communications and computers or programming or whatever. And they think that's where they're going to get their real education. Then they wind up in Afghanistan. And so you have this cycle, almost a cycle of violence in a way, of mental violence, if you will. And it perpetuates itself. And it's funny, these people who come back, many of them that come back, are not pro-war anymore. They don't want any part of it, and then and it really bothers me. The people that I blame, Daniel, I don't blame the government. You know who I blame? I blame the parents. Where the heck are the parents? I mean, if my son came to me, and said, hey, I want to go to Afghanistan and kill Taliban or whatever, I'd smack him in the head, until his brains rattled, until he got brains at least got lined up with the cosmos or something so he can think again. I mean, aren't the parents saying anything to these kids, saying, hey, guess what? These guys that are just a bunch of slime balls are perpetrating this. And when you hear the term, every time I hear see someone on television being introduced, everyone says, oh, thank you for your service. And my question is, to whom? Not to me, not to your country. It's to the banksters in the military-industrial complex. Aren't the parents saying something about that? Or are they just as numb as the kids?
Well, this is part of the biggest scam in history that I was talking about. The parents in the rest of America that aren't getting rich in the Beltway, they're given a flag to hold and told that it means something. You send your son off fighting for America, fighting for our freedom. If it wasn't for our soldiers, we'd all be speaking Russian or Cambodian or something now. So I blame them. You're right. They should have more sense. But to be fair, you also have to blame the media. The media is the biggest mouthpiece for government in history. I mean, I think the Soviets could only dream about having such a lapdog media as we have here in the U.S.
Yeah.
And the people are brainwashed. I was just reading an article by Stephen Kinzer, who is a terrific writer. He wrote this wonderful book called The Brothers, about the Dulles brothers. And he did a piece in the Boston Globe a few days ago, and he talked about how the media coverage of Syria is one of the darkest chapters in U.S. media history. They absolutely push the government line. They don't question anything. Aleppo in Syria has been occupied for 3 years by a bunch of crazed jihadists. And the Syrian army of Assad, whatever Assad's fault, it's not the issue right here. They're going to take this back from these crazed jihadists, and all of a sudden Aleppo is going to fall. And so Kinzer writes about this. The people who live there don't view it as falling. They view themselves as being liberated. And
right.
He points out that as soon as it was occupied by these jihadists, they sent out flyers to everyone saying, if you send your kid to school, we're going to steal his backpack and your kid will come home in a coffin. So these are our allies. But the media just doesn't question it. So, yeah, we are so dumbed down. Thank goodness for the alternative media, things that you do and that we do and others. At least we are still allowed to provide some alternative. The mainstream, it's over. It's done. They are the government mouthpiece.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, would you please hold on for about 1 minute? We just need to stop for 1 minute of station identification. We'll be right back. I do want to continue the conversation on Syria because I have to admit that it is. I find it very confusing, and I think I'm full of misinformation. And maybe you could at least square me away. Okay.
Okay, sure.
Okay, folks, don't go away. We're going to stop for station identification. Do not go away. Remember, our number is 646-652-4620. We'll be right back.
Radio. Political talk derived from a historical perspective. Not always palatable, but good food for thought. Pure libertarian talk with host Joe Cristiano. LibertyTalkRadio.com.
Express Test is your go-to company for on-site occupational health testing services. That's right, we said on-site. That means we will meet you at your facility for a free health and occupational safety consultation. Express Test specializes in hearing conservation, respiratory protection, and employee safety. We can help you establish viable programs tailored to your business and employee needs. For your free consultation, call 918-743-2929 or visit us at expresstest.com. That's 918-743-2929 or expresstest.com.
Ranch Acres Audiology is about caring, about getting the most out of life, about personal attention.
Sometimes helping someone with their hearing is really helping them with more than just hearing. That's the goal of my practice. That's what my goal has been for 20 years.
You're invited to attend our next free Lunch and Learn seminar. Call us today, 918-749-7711.
This isn't your typical talk radio show. This is Liberty. Liberty Talk Radio.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Joe Cristiano. You're listening to America's Libertarian Voice. With us today, we're pleased to have Mr. Daniel McAdams, the Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. And we're talking about a myriad of concepts. We're going to be talking about Syria. But before we do that, Daniel, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I wanted to make sure you didn't sneak out of the room on me. All right. We do have a couple of calls on line. Which line do you want to take first? All right. Well, let's take line one. Caller, you're on line one. Caller, you're there. Oh, here we go. We have a little technical difficulty.
Hello.
Hello. Caller, you're on the air.
Yes.
Yes, your question, please, or your comment.
I was just commenting on you were talking about the enlisted personnel who come home and the ravages of war to our own society, but really even globally, what's happening in the Middle East with Syria and things like that. I saw an article today, and this has nothing really to do with the war or a country that was involved in the war, but is suffering the effects of the surrounding countries who were in war. Beirut has taken on over 1 million refugees, and now they have a trash crisis. They have a river of trash down the main part of the city. They have a dysfunctional government, and it's made worse by this refugee crisis, which they can't solve the trash problem. They can't solve, and you can sort of trace all these things back to the war. And this is not just the United States problem, but this is a global problem when you have an interventionist type government and something that it calculates a lot of things in terms of the losses they're willing to accept and things like that, but it doesn't really, it does not calculate the devastation to humanity in general. And it seems like there should be some sort of metric for that. But in this day and age, I mean, that seems pretty far-fetched. But it was just an interesting story about how a country that was not involved in the war and had nothing to do with it, didn't have any fighting force there, ends up suffering as a result of it. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor for what happens when you play with things the way we have.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, how do you respond to that? And where's the UN, by the way? I thought the UN was supposed to be the world's policeman.
Well, the UN, interestingly enough, and we've been critical for good reason of the UN, but the UN in its concept, in its origin, was an organization that was meant to defend national sovereignty. It was based on the sovereignty of the nation state. And as a concept, that sounds pretty good, actually. But what's happened to the UN, of course, obviously it's designed to fail. Any kind of unaccountable world organization like this is designed to fail through corruption and other things. Conceptually, it's correct. But what happened to the UN, especially I think if you look at the last 20 years or so, the U.S. has essentially taken over. I mean, we're the largest contributor. We send the most money there. But back in the mid-2000s, the UN adopted this new policy called Responsibility to Protect, R2P. And what that did is turn the entire UN concept on its head. It meant that no longer do we respect the sovereignty of a state. If we think that a state is mistreating its people, we will pass a Security Council resolution that will authorize the use of force to go in there and correct that mistake, so-called mistake. And this has been a disaster. We look at what happened in Libya, I think, is a prime example. And what happens is these things are based on lies. The assertion that Gaddafi was about to go to Benghazi and slaughter his own people was an absolute lie. It's been proven. Doesn't mean we love Gaddafi. It means that the warmongers lied about it. They lied and they cost us a lot of money and they cost a lot of lives. But they use the UN and they use it as their tool to push their agenda, whether on the left interventionists, or the neocons on the right. So where is the UN? The UN has given up on sovereignty. Who knows? Half of the officials in the UN probably have a video in someone's hands, and they're telling him, "You better do what we say, or this is going to get out." Who knows? But when it comes to these sort of things, the UN is almost useless.
Yeah. Caller, does that satisfy you?
Sure. Yeah. He's right. Since it seems over the last decade, this sort of thing is getting worse and worse and worse, and there's less and less accountability, I suppose. So,
well, yeah. Let me ask you, caller, if your son or daughter said, "Dad, I want to enlist in the Army," what would be your response?
No, I would just, if I had any control over the situation at all, I would say no, and end the conversation there.
And the conversation would end right there.
It's a noble pursuit, but the truth is you don't know the truth up front, and you don't know the supposed outcome. Yeah.
Okay. Cole, thank you so much for calling Liberty Talk Radio. Appreciate you calling in and your listenership. Okay, now we have a caller on line 2. Are they still there? Oh, line 2 went way. Bye-bye. Nope. No caller. We lost line 2. Okay. Now, Daniel, I find the Syrian situation incredibly confusing. I understand that Putin and the United States and also some rebels they got together and they have some sort of ceasefire agreement or whatever. But apparently the Syrian government was not involved in that conversation. And I'm sure I'm not the only American that's a little confused as to what's going on in Syria and why we're there in the first place. Why we're there is beyond me. It's 6,000 miles away. And I don't think Syria is going to be attacking us any day soon. But could you sort of unravel that and make it understandable as to what we're doing, if anything, if we're doing any good there at all?
Yeah, I would have to go back. And the question is, how far do you go back? And I don't want to put your listeners to sleep. But you'd have to go back to the 90s with the Project for the New American Century. This is a neocon outfit that they were in the habit of writing strongly worded letters to leaders, to Bush and to Clinton about you've got to overthrow Saddam and this and that. But they sort of laid out the countries that they would like to see a regime change in. And Iraq was one of them, and we saw what happened there. And Syria was on the menu. Iran is on the menu. And their idea is that we can remake the Middle East. This is the neocon worldview. This is they are Trotskyites essentially in their DNA, their intellectual DNA. And Trotsky believed in a world revolution, through the barrel of a gun. And they essentially believe the same thing. You can force people, you can remake people how you want them if you just overthrow this person and put this person in. So this is the idea they had. And a lot of it had to do with destroying secular governments in the Middle East. So this is the 90s. Let's skip forward to 2006. An important memo, a communique from the U.S. Embassy in Damascus back to the State Department was released a couple of years ago by WikiLeaks. And I think this is really a smoking gun document because the political officer at the time wrote back, this is a secure cable back to Washington, outlining 9 points, 9 ways that the U.S. government could undermine the Syrian government and to help foment an overthrow of the Syrian regime. And let's not forget, this was just a couple of years after the U.S. had been cooperating with Syria. In fact, in some dirty business, in some renditions and things like this, Syria had been very eager to cooperate with the U.S. But here we're seeing behind the scenes, the State Department is thinking, how are we going to overthrow this guy? One of the things, and this is prescient if you think about it, one of the points they made was we need to get the jihadists riled up and get them excited, and because this will have a real effect of undermining the regime. And that's exactly what happened. So you fast forward to 2011 when you have this Arab Spring, which was sold to Americans as this wonderful Arab uprising for democracy, and they were finally coming on board with democracy. And of course, it was mostly a farce.
Yes.
A lot of this was directed by the State Department, the CIA, the different NGOs that are paid by them. And the proof is in the fruits of this as well. Look at Egypt; it's far worse off than it was even under Mubarak. Look at Libya. Look at all of these regime change countries. So Syria was part of the Arab Spring. There was an uprising that took place, and without going too far into the anatomy of a regime change uprising, there has to be some discontent with government. There has to be some genuine opposition, which is true anywhere.
Right.
We had Occupy Wall Street, we had Tea Party, so there has to be some discontent, and there was in Syria. It was economic. The price of bread had gone up, and people were ticked off about that. But the thing is, how do you exploit that natural feeling of protest and ramp it up and times it by 1,000 and introduce the idea of extreme violence into the protest? The same thing happened in Ukraine, by the way. We can talk about that later if you like, but you inject extreme violence. What most Americans don't understand is that jihadists were involved in the Syrian uprising from day one. Violence occurred on day one of the protests, extreme violence against government forces trying to provoke a reaction. And so that's how it started. What they didn't count on is the fact, and this is not an apology for Assad by any stretch, it's a critique of American policy. But what they miscalculated, because support for Assad in Syria had been very, very deep. And even to this day, they say something like 70% of the people would vote for him if he ran. So there is strong support for him. That's why he was able to survive this long. But unfortunately, the country that he's governed has been turned to dust.
Right.
So even if he does win, there's not a heck of a lot of Syria left.
Right. Yeah. All right. Hold on for a second. We have a caller on line. Which line? Line one. Okay. Caller, you're on the air. Line one.
Hello, Joe.
Yes.
This is Lloyd.
Lloyd, thank you for calling.
Yeah, you guys seem to not realize what you're talking about. You guys are talking like all these nations should be sovereign. And you were talking about earlier that the United States acting as the policeman of the world. Well, to me, isn't that a good thing? That shouldn't there be one policeman of the world and one leader ruling over all the nations of the world? Kind of like, 13th chapter of Revelations?
But good question. I mean, I don't know how we would do that, but I'll let our guest see if he can take a crack at it, because that's beyond my pay grade.
Well, there certainly are moral objections. Ruling over people who don't want to be ruled is called tyranny. The Soviet Union tried it. Mao Zedong tried it. Eventually, it failed. So there's certainly a moral argument on imposing your will on other countries. But say that doesn't have much sway over, I don't know the belief system of the gentleman who called, but perhaps that doesn't have much sway. Let's look at an economic argument. Look at the debasement of the American currency over the past 100 years. The money that's been spent to create and to prop up the American empire overseas. The dollar of 1913, when the Federal Reserve was created, is now worth 3 cents. So that means the rest of us are having our economy destroyed to pay for a world empire that doesn't work, that just makes more enemies. And how say someone who wants us to be the power of the world, how can we be the world's power when we have destroyed our currency to the degree that our economy is shot? Does anyone think that when we really, when the you know what really hits the fan, and we have 2008 crisis times a million, which is coming, when that happens and our economy is shot and we have worthless paper in our hands like the Germans had after World War I, do you think that the rest of the world, who were furious with us for imposing our will on them, are they going to take any pity on us at all? Or are they going to put a jackboot on our neck and keep pushing until it's all done? So that's the downside of empire. You tick off the world, you destroy our economy, you make us weak, and you make us vulnerable. That's the downside.
Lloyd, how would you go about electing a leader of the world when you have all of these countries? I mean, I can't even think of the process that you would have to go through.
Well, see, that's what is necessary, is to eliminate all of the individual sovereign nations. Then you have one world leader, a one world government, and then you don't have them fighting among themselves. Kind of like the United States of America.
Oh, I see. All right. I think you're being facetious now. I think you're pulling my leg. I'll be honest with you.
We're under the federal government, which provides us the benefits of the IRS, Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Education, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Energy, and all those things benefit all of the people here in the United States. And if you think that the nation should be not under a one world government, isn't that what would be called anarchy without government?
Yeah,
and then you would also probably be going along the line that maybe the states ought to be sovereign and not under the federal government, so that the states could also be in anarchy.
Well, that's right. I believe that the United States should be a confederation of states, and the United States should not be a republic. We would have been much better off, and we wouldn't have all these overseas commitments and interference. You're absolutely right. I'm an advocate of a confederation of states, with the sovereignty of each state being intact.
Yeah. Well,
so that's the opposite.
Throwing that
right?
out there, you get the line of thinking that
right.
the nation states of the world are all in what would be termed anarchy, in the sense that they're not under a world government. If our states were independent from the federal government, that would also be considered anarchy.
That's
because
right.
They're not under a federal government. And I was just trying, I don't know if Daniel quite caught what I was doing there at the first. I'm trying to bring it down to the thing that maybe there's too much government instead of not enough.
I agree. Okay, caller. Thank you, Lloyd, for calling in. I appreciate your calling in and your listenership. We do have a call on line 2. Line 2, you're on the air. Line 2, you're on the air. Are they
Can you
there?
hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Enjoying the show. I started a couple minutes late when Daniel was talking about Ron Paul and him and the Institute having a gathering or meeting with third-party candidates. And so I have two questions for you. One is, do you and Dr. Paul feel that any of the third parties, Libertarian, Green, Constitutionist, are they making any strides? Because it just seems like such an uphill battle with the two lead parties being so dominant and wanting to exclude third parties. And then secondly, without dwelling on Donald Trump, because ad nauseum we hear about him every day, and I understand that his phenomenon is really an outgrowth of the angry American that's fed up with what's going on in Washington. But that said, I'm curious as to how you and Dr. Paul feel about the possibility of a Ron Trump presidency, because it scares the hell out of me.
Yeah. Caller, would you consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, or independent, or libertarian, or what? How would you classify yourself, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm in principle, I lean libertarian, but I'm fiercely independent.
Okay, very good. All right, thank you very much. Well, how do you answer to that?
On third parties, it's a very good question. And, There's the old line that Dr. Paul always says, and never gets old to me. He says, they ask him about a third party. He says, I wouldn't mind a second party. The Republicans and Democrats are so close on so many things. But, this is the other thing that's very frustrating, because we go around the world preaching democracy, preaching multi-party democracy to all these countries till we're blue in the face. But yet here in the U.S., if you want to put forth a third party for any serious office, the barriers are nearly insurmountable. You spend millions and millions of dollars just on ballot access. And then, if you want to get into the debates, well, those are controlled by the R's and D's. Are they going to let you in? Forget it. It's not going to happen. So we have a really fundamental problem with our form of government here in the U.S. And that's one of the reasons why, Dr. Paul has always considered himself an educator rather than a legislator. They accuse him of not getting things done in Washington. He said, that's good. I didn't need to. Right. But so, we have to, but he also says, that, if the people get their minds changed, the politicians will follow. And that really is our mission here at the Institute, and what Ron Paul is doing post-Hill retirement. He's busier than ever, but that's what we're doing. As to the Trump phenomenon, I liked your characterization of the angry Americans, and that certainly I think sums it up. America is really angry. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite understand why it's angry. It doesn't understand what's making Americans don't understand who's making their lives miserable, what's causing their lives to be miserable. They don't understand that they're not getting ahead because of things like the Federal Reserve, which print money at will and debase our currency for adventures overseas to bail out the big international banksters. Who knows how much money the Greeks got as a bailout from the U.S., the Germans. You can bet your bottom dollar that if the ECB runs into trouble, you'll have Janet Yellen running over there with their helicopter. So they don't understand the Federal Reserve is a problem. They don't understand the neocons are lying to them. They're selling them phony patriotism, anti-Americanism, and wrapping it up as patriotism. So they're turning to someone like Donald Trump, who is an extraordinary communicator. He is a natural. He's entertaining, and he's charismatic. He's dynamic. It's pretty frightening, those of us who lean toward no government or as little as possible, to see a charismatic person whose theme is "I will get things done," and that is very troubling, because we don't like power concentrated in one person, but we certainly can understand the phenomenon.
Yes, and I agree. I like Dr. Paul's comment on wanting a second party. I've referred to. I come from a divided family, and I talk to them about it being two sides of the same coin. And that it seems like, years ago, I'm in my mid-late 50s. When I was younger, it seemed like the Democrats were known as the welfare party and the Republicans as the warfare party. Today, it seems like they both like war, they both like big government, and the only dividing issues seem to be the morality issues. And I would contend that the powers to be and the money changers really don't give a damn about gay marriage, stem cell research, and abortion.
Yeah. Fair point.
So, and anyways, hey, I applaud you so much for what you're doing. Keep up the good work, and thanks for being on the program today.
Thank you, caller. Thank you very much. Daniel, I want to throw something out that I did not intend to do, but I just feel compelled to do so. So often we hear that our government does not run this nation, but the banksters, as they call them, do. And for example, there are those who say that when President Jack Kennedy signed an executive order, which is not very well known to the public, dissolving the Federal Reserve Bank, he walked into a bullet. When Saddam Hussein decided to disrespect the petrodollar and decide to trade his oil for local currencies, he, all of a sudden he had weapons of mass destruction. He had to go. The same thing in Iran, when we no longer had the control of that nation through a propped-up dictator, sanctions, and hundreds of thousands of children died as a result of those sanctions. Libya was the richest country in Africa. When the Gaddafi decided to introduce the Afrikaan, which is a gold-backed currency for the nations of Africa, all of a sudden he had to go. Now, that may be all coincidence, and I don't mean to be a conspiratorial person or whatever, but there seems to be a consistency through all of that. From your perspective, is there any truth to that? Is there any logic to that, or is that just random acts that we're just trying to put together to make ourselves feel better that we're right?
I'll add one to that from what I read, and I think it's true. But Tunisia, at the dawn of the so-called Arab Spring, was about to get rid of its central bank. Is what I had read too. So there's another one for the.
Oh boy, I did not know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. But the a very good friend of mine, Mike Lofgren, who we worked together in Congress. He was a staffer as well. He's since retired, and you may have heard the name, but he's gone on to write a couple of books. His newest one is on the deep state, and it's a terrific book, Mike Lofgren. But what he points out, and I think it's very valid, is these are open conspiracies. These aren't in secret. These are the people who are above elected officials. They don't care who's elected, and they do it in the open. The banksters, as you point out, the various levels of federal bureaucracy who essentially make laws. Anyone who thinks the FDA doesn't make laws or the EPA doesn't make laws is mistaken. They have the force of law. So this is the permanent government. It operates in the open. It doesn't need to be conspiratorial because there's no one really challenging it. So do the banksters get together and make these regulations and things? Sure. Do we know the direct connection between the events that you pointed out? I personally don't. I've read about them, but I'm certainly willing to believe any of them, knowing what I do about the open conspiracy that's out there.
Yeah. Well, there are too many conspiracy theories. Whenever someone mentions that within a group, everyone's getting given the eye like, oh, you're one of those, crazy 9/11 guys, type thing. But when you start connecting the dots, they uncannily they make a tremendous amount of sense. I mean, it makes sense as to why we're doing what we're doing. Any other explanation doesn't make sense, but yet we tend to accept that first before we accept any theories that are outside of what is popularly being espoused on mainstream television.
Yeah, it's true. And I think, obviously you can take it way too far. I like to look for facts. I'm willing to believe anything. The night you mentioned 9/11, I don't know who did it or what did it or how they did it. The only thing I know is that the government is not telling us the truth. It may well have happened the way they said, but the reports and things they've done, they lie to us all the time. So this is not a conspiracy. This is, I don't trust the government investigating the government's failure. It doesn't make sense on its face.
Yeah. Well, the only one thing I know about 9/11 is that I own a occupational health testing company, and one of our specialties is respirator fit testing. We do physicals and a lot of that stuff. But and at one time, I was the preeminent expert on respirators in the state of Oklahoma. If you had a question about respirators, you came to me because I fit every respirator on 1,000 people probably at the time, every make and every model known to mankind. And was very little that I just didn't know about respirators. And when I watched the towers come down and then they said that the government was providing respirators for everyone, I knew that was a lie because there was not enough in the just-in-time inventory to handle that. I know because my clients are always saying, I need 40 respirators. They can only get 3 or 4 at a time, And all of a sudden, thousands of respirators showed up. Well, I knew that wasn't true, and I called a friend of mine who was a rep for 3M Corporation who made they're a large manufacturer of respirators, and who was there on the scene, actually, flew up there, and he said, no, they did not provide respirators. They supplied dust masks, and as a result, many people died.
Jeez.
But I'm just saying that's the only thing that I know for sure. I mean, that's for fact, and I'll testify that in court as an expert witness. And so from that day forward, I started to be suspicious about everything the government said about 9/11. But we can't get there because we're out of time. Daniel, I want to thank you so much for being on our program. We do wish that you would accept our invitation to return at a later date.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for having me.
Folks, this is Daniel McAdams. He's the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. And thank you so much for being on our program. And do me a favor, would you please give my regards to Ron Paul? He has my card. It's in his pocket on the right-hand side. He put it there. I know I saw him do it, okay? Do me that one favor. All right. Thank you so much, Daniel. Appreciate it. Okay, folks, this is the end of today's broadcast. We'd like to thank our sponsors for the financial support, and we'd like to thank you for listening in. You can further the cause of liberty by recommending this program to your friends, and let us hear from you. Our email address is comments@libertytalkradio.com. Remember, you're either allowing your liberties to be taken away or you're striving to protect them. Unfortunately, there is no middle ground. Until next time, this is Joe Cristiano. You've been listening to Liberty Talk Radio. Stay well. Stay tuned.